year of transition for both myself and the church. And as someone who was new to this pastoring gig, much of my reading and personal prayer was searching for an understanding or a personal revelation around who we are as a church, what mattered to us, and where I felt God was leading us. That revelation was found in chapter 20 of Matthew, where Jesus is said to be teaching in the region of Judea. And at one point, among other things, he shares a story on the parable that is focused on being fair and just and the importance of discipleship. And then he gets to this point. It says that he started heading towards Jerusalem, where he's approached by the mother of two of his disciples. And what followed was a conversation that resonated with me at this time. And that was the understanding that I felt God was calling us as a church that we would be known for our willingness to serve one another. It comes from Matthew chapter 20. It'll come up on the screens. It says this. It says, "Then the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons. She knelt respectfully to ask a favor. 'What is your request?' he asked. She replied, 'In your kingdom, please let my two sons sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and the other on your left.' But Jesus answered by saying to them, 'You don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I'm about to drink?' 'Oh, yes,' they replied, 'we are able.' Jesus told them, 'You will indeed drink from my bitter cup, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or on my left. My Father has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen.'" Verse 24, "When the 10 other disciples heard what Jesus and John had asked, they were indignant. But Jesus called them together and said, 'You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. But among you it will be different.'" In my Bible, I underlined it, I bolded it, I highlighted. When it said, "But among you it will be different." And then he goes on and says this. This is Jesus speaking. He says, "Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be the first among you must become your slave." That's the terms they use then. Verse 28, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many." In this encounter, we read at the start there that Jesus is approached by an eager mum who wanted the best for her sons. And if I'm honest, I kind of admire her desire to see her kids thrive, even though she was probably best suited on the reality TV show Dance Mums. But I also get the understanding that the other 10 disciples, it says, felt indignant. Why? Because in our human constraints, in our structure of who we are self-absorbed people. I don't want to bring this down here because we've just had an up. But the reality is, when someone gets a leg up, when someone's in these things, we kind of go to that Moving Pictures song and say, "What about me? It isn't fair." That's enough. Right? We do. Inside of us, we kind of go, well, I wanted that promotion. What about me? And so I can understand how the other 10 disciples were sort of going, well, I love the term, they were indignant. They were indignant that two of them might get a bit of a head up over somebody else. Having lived overseas for 5 years, one of the things that came out most is that the majority of the community that we lived in couldn't understand the Aussie syndrome of what we call the tall poppy syndrome. They just didn't understand it. Whereby we try and tear down those who have made it to the top, regardless of how they may have done it. What grabbed me, though, out of this scripture as I read this was the search for our church identity was found for me in that last verse of this interaction between Jesus, the disciples, and an overambitious mum. Jesus, speaking in the third person, says this. He says, "For even the Son of Man," he's talking about himself, "came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, for context, even though the religious leaders of the day did not deem him as a king, in fact, they mocked him at his crucifixion by putting a sign, "King of the Jews." That was not a respectful thing. That was a mocking thing that they did. So even though the religious leaders didn't see him as a king, the reality is Jesus was the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. In Revelation 17 and 19 and all the way through, it emphasizes the point, saying that there is no higher authority. As a side note, if you want to be inspired, look up YouTube and type in "That's My King" by S.M. Lockridge. It's had over 10 million views and it will inspire you. The reality is, though, is that Jesus came as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the authority over all. Revelation 17, 19, read them through. Between 2007 and 2012, I worked in close proximity to a king. He was an earthly king. He was a guy who sat on a throne and wore a crown on his head. Well, he didn't really have a crown, but he wore a crown on his head. And I was always staggered at how any given day, over 300 people were involved in the structuring and the execution of his day. And he was actually an incredibly humble man, and he really didn't crave this sort of stuff. Yet there was over 300 people every day were there for the needs of the king, to serve the needs of the king. Here was Jesus, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the King of all ages, the King of righteousness, the one who was enduringly strong, entirely sincere, eternally steadfast, immorally graceful. If anyone was excused from serving others, it was Jesus. Yet in this exact moment, he draws his bickering, indignant disciples together, and he said, "I came to earth with a heart to serve others, not to be served." I kind of would have loved to seen the expression on the disciples' faces as he did that. I reckon they kind of just said, "Okay, forget what we said. Forget about the fact that we just had a little bit of a tantrum here." When Jesus, the King of Kings, let's put this in perspective, he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, stands there in front of them and says, "Hey, I came to serve others. What about you?" I want to share 3 thoughts on how this has formed in my life around this attitude of serving. The first is this, that we need to forget our own limitations. Forget our own limitations. I heard it once said, our fear of doing the wrong thing stops us from doing anything, which precludes us from serving anyone at all. So often we don't put up our hand to serve because we fear that we are limited in what we can bring, or maybe that we will mess it up, or maybe worse, that we are still a mess up. But I'm broken. How can I serve others if I'm broken? You don't know my history. I hurt people. I'm broken. I'm selfish. I did whatever it is. So how can I hurt people? And so we put this limitation upon ourselves that we're still messed up. So how could we help somebody else? In his book, The Purpose-Driven Life, Rick Warren points out that God uses imperfect people. He says this. He says, Abraham was old. Jacob was insecure. Leah was unattractive. Joseph was abused and Moses stuttered, just to name a few. He goes on and says, well, Gideon was poor. Samson was codependent. Rahab was immoral. David had an affair and all kinds of family problems, and Elijah was suicidal. He continues and says Jeremiah was depressed. Jonah was reluctant. Naomi was a widow and John the Baptist was eccentric. Peter was impulsive and hot-tempered. Martha worried a lot. The Samaritan woman had several failed marriages. Zacchaeus was unpopular. Thomas had doubts. Paul had poor health. And Timothy was timid. They all had limitations. Yet God used them to serve others. As I reflected on this, I was reminded of the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. I won't read it for time's sake. But it would have been easy for the Samaritan man to just keep on walking. For a little bit of context, at the time, the Samaritans were not popular. They were kind of like seen as the misfits, the outcast. The Gentiles is helping the good Samaritan. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about here. I'm just trying to get through this quickly. But the reality is it would have been so easy for him to go to his limitations and walk to the other side. Yet what did he do? He saw a need and he served. In fact, he went above and beyond in his serving. When it's so easy to say, hey, my whole people are messed up. We're the messed up people. We're the misfits. We're limited in the things that we do. So often we don't step in to serve because we feel limited in what we can bring. But I'm only good at hospitality. Well, then join the cooking team. Or invite someone over for lunch today. I've shared the story before. I grew up in a church family, which I'm incredibly thankful for. We didn't have much, but my mum was a good cook. She was a farm wife, man. She was a good cook. Every Sunday after church, she would buy a roast chicken and rolls and chips and would invite someone new in the church to come around for a lunch. That was her skill set. That's what she used. She passed on her skills to me of not being able to use a drill or any of those things there. But she knew how to cook. And so she did that. My second thing is this. We need to check our attitude. Check our attitude. In his book, None of These Diseases, S.I. McMillan tells about a young woman who wanted to go to college. But her heart sank when she read the question on the application that asked, "Are you a leader?" Being both honest and conscientious, she wrote, "No." Returned the application expecting the very worst. To her surprise, she received this letter from the college that said, "Dear applicant, a study of the forms reveals that this year our college will have 1,452 new leaders. We are accepting you because we feel it imperative that they have at least one follower." We need leaders, no question about it. However, we need leaders who are able to follow. We need leaders who are aiming to be team players. If you're not able to follow, you're not ready to lead. One guy once said to me, he came up to me in the church and he said, "But if I don't work in my area of leadership, I'm squandering my talent." Maybe so, but in the area he wants you to work, we don't need leaders, we need workers. We need people who are going to roll up their sleeves and lay out the mats in the prison and cook the barbecues. I love this church because those with so much can stand next to those who have little. And together we can serve. I love the But to Serve weekend. And I love the opportunities we have where men and women of all diversities and colours and languages, those who have much and those who have little, we stand together and we serve those who are in need. Those at the Hobart City Mission who are in need. Those in our Migrant Resource Centre who are in need or looking for a heads up. We heard a story yesterday of a family, as Stuart was talking about in the Migrant Resource Centre, that a family that have come here very recently, about 6 weeks ago, who have been for 16 years in a refugee camp. And I loved how our team stood beside them and made them feel like they were kings, made them feel like they were worthy and that they were valued. For 16 years through no fault of their own, simply because where they were born, they were in a refugee camp, yet they came here and we said, "How can we serve you?" We can get so caught up in title and position and such that we lose the reason why we serve. Paul said to the church in Colossians, he said, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward." You are serving the King of Kings. We can spend our life focusing on what we will get from this, what is our investment in this, or we can turn around and spend our life focusing on what we can do for others. And my third point is this. Thanks, Andrew. My third point is this. Is be generous in all of your ways. For Morella and I, we are so blessed. I actually struggle preaching this message this morning because we are so blessed to lead a church that is generous. So blessed. In your finances, in your giving, in your time. We know that many of you do 60-hour weeks and then once a month go and help in one of our projects. And we're so blessed. We're kind of a little bit, in a right way, a little bit proud. We're proud when we go around and we get to see every single site on the But to Serve day. We get an itinerary that's there, and Bal and Christelle do it for us, and we get like 27 minutes at each site, so that we can make sure we see them all. Because when we go there, there's something very, very special. But I want to encourage us to continue to step in being generous. I shared a passage in my giving word the other day out of Luke chapter 6, verse 38. It says this, and I want to give some context to it. It says, "Give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. The amount you give," listen to this, "the amount you give will determine the amount you get back." And let me give some context to this. Let me be very clear as to the context of this passage. It is around forgiveness. The scripture is around forgiveness. We use it for offering, and I think it's great for that, but it is around forgiveness. But the underlying theme is to be generous in that forgiving. Don't hold back your forgiveness because you want to see what you get in return. Don't we'll make a deal. I'll forgive you, but only if you forgive me back. Be generous. Be generous in your forgiveness. Be generous in your grace. Be generous in your mercy. Be generous in your willingness to serve. Be generous in the tithe, the finances that you've been blessed with. Be generous. As I said, the heart of that scripture is around forgiveness, but there's an underlying theme in there of saying, be generous. Because the Lord sees our generosity. I've asked the team to put the QR code for our vision builders up on the screen. It's not something that I do very often in church at all. But I just felt as we were talking about But to Serve today, as we were talking about helping those in our community, I'm very mindful, because people come to me, that there's a lot of new people arrive in our church every single week, and you're sitting there going, but I don't even know about this. I've never had the opportunity. And I never want to be one who doesn't give you the opportunity. We were blessed earlier this year, if you've been around us for a while. Over-blessed to pay off this building. A monumentous achievement. Phenomenal, and people have been faithful in that for over 25 years. Faithful to the vision of our founding pastors who stepped into this. But what excited me about that was not the fact that we have to pay a bank any more money. That's exciting in itself. They can do without ours, it's all right. But what excited me about that is that every dollar we get into our vision builders now goes to exactly what you've just heard today. That's what it goes into. We don't have to pay a bank anymore. Gone, it's done. See you later. We will, because God's going to call us to multiply. God's going to call us to multiply, so don't get too comfortable. But what we get to do is that money gets to put up a basketball court in the prison. And it's not simply about saying, hey, look at us, here's a basketball court. It's about building a relationship with those men in particular in there. It's about the fact that we can step into small steps. Where the first year, we've been doing that for 5 years out there at Small Steps. I can tell you, I went there the first time, and honestly, the women hid behind the curtains and didn't come out. This year, they stood side by side next to our people painting the walls. That's what it's about. Stuart talked about it at the Migrant Resource Centre. We went out there last year, and they hid in their little porta cabins. Not one of them came out except for food time. Everyone comes out for food time. This year, they were everywhere. This year, 35 of them turned up yesterday to a church service. Do you know what? In what would have been sounded like broken English to them, yesterday 6 people gave their lives to Jesus for the very first time. One is an Afghan young boy. He's 21. I got to speak with him afterwards. He was born in a refugee camp. He feels so privileged that he gets to be in Hobart. His English was pretty good, as Stewie said. He was so privileged that he gets to be here. Do you know what he said to me? I spoke to him afterwards. I saw him and I spoke to him afterwards. Just given his life to Jesus. And his first thing he said to me is, he said, "What can I do to help?" I'm like, man, I want to serve you, buddy. I want to make up for lost time. His first thing to do is, what can I do to help? We are so proud of a church that has a heart to give. As we come to a close, I want to leave us with a quote, and then I've asked the team to do that song, All Hail King Jesus. I'm going to ask them to keep it down because I want the vocals to come out. Because that's what it's about, is we serve the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But I want to finish with a quote. It's from the 18th century theologian John Wesley, who once said this. He said, "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can." God bless.
We stand.